And Dr. McGuire, can I ask you to do the same?
My name is Dr. Michael McGuire.
Professor McCulloch and Dr. McGuire, do each of you undertake to provide truthful evidence to the Yoorrook Justice Commission? First you, Professor McCulloch.
I do.
Dr. McGuire?
I do.
Thank you. You've prepared a submission for the Yoorrook Justice Commission, which is headed Submission on Systemic Injustice in the Criminal Justice System, Focus on Police Oversight in Victoria as a joint submission.
Correct.
Yes.
Dr. McGuire, I might start with some introductions. Dr. McGuire, if I can start with you. You were the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland between 2012 and 2019, responsible for misconduct and criminal investigations into police officers, including high-profile investigations into contemporary policing and allegations of criminality and misconduct within the Royal Ulster Constabulary during the Northern Ireland conflict. Before that, you were the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice in Northern Ireland. You are a member of Yoorrook's Expert Advisory Panel, and you recently gave evidence to the Queensland Commission of Inquiry into the policing of family and domestic violence. Are there other aspects of your work or your work experience that you'd like to highlight?
I think those are the main ones. I was 18 years as a management consultant specialising in strategy and organisational design, primarily in the public sector.
And Professor McCulloch, you're Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Monash University, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and you are internationally recognised as an expert on police militarisation and accountability. You're the author or editor of 13 books, including Blue Army, Paramilitary Policing, 2001, and more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and chapters relating to policing, crime and justice. You've been contracted to provide research to Victoria Police on topics including counter-terrorism policing and culturally diverse communities, hate crime and the use of body-worn cameras and family violence matters. You've given evidence to the coroner in Northern Territory in relation to the shooting of an Aboriginal man, and you are the co-author with Dr. McGuire of a peer-reviewed journal article headed Reforming Police Oversight in Victoria, Lessons from Northern Ireland 2022. That article is attached to your submission. Are there other aspects of your qualifications or your work that you would like to highlight?
No, that covers it. Thank you.
Now, your submission calls for the establishment of a substantially independent, adequately resourced, appropriately empowered, standalone body to respond to complaints against police and initiate investigations of specific events or systemic and thematic issues. I'll come to consider the shortcomings of the existing systems of police oversight and your recommendations for the design of a new civilian-controlled oversight body for Victoria in a moment. But before we turn to that, I want to ask you about the history of police oversight in this state. So can I start with you, Professor McCulloch? In your submission, you address the impact of policing and incarceration practices on First Nations peoples. Can I ask you to speak to the connection between historic and continuing injustice in Victoria based on your research and your expertise, to offer the Commission your insights into how it is that First Nations people are overrepresented and over-policed in our criminal justice system?
I understand, Commissioners, you've got plenty of information, statistical information about the overrepresentation of Victoria's First Nations people in the criminal justice system. It's my view, and backed up by the research, that policing, and particularly the over-policing of First Nations people as potential offenders, or the targeting of them as potential offenders and criminals, and the underserving of First Nations people, particularly women, as victims of crime is really critical to the outcomes, the very poor outcomes that we see for Victorian First Nations people in the criminal justice system. All the research shows that as the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system, that police are highly influential on outcomes. So while there may be some checks and balances along the way, at least formally in the system, once First Nations people or people low on the social hierarchy are brought into the criminal justice system through the use of police discretion, targeting, etc., then they're really quickly flushed through that system and can very much end up incarcerated and other poor outcomes along the way. My understanding and view, based on my research, is that police have been key players in colonialisation and establishing colonial relations of power where Indigenous people are subjugated, coerced, punished summarily since settlement. So the first police in Port Phillip, which of course has become Victoria, their role was basically to overcome Aboriginal or First Nations people's resistance to occupation. And there were many casual killings of Indigenous people, First Nations people that police were involved in. There were many massacres that police were involved in or part of. There was brutalisation and coercion and very little accountability for that. While the role of the first police was formally to protect everyone, including First Nations people, in practice, police were very much at the front line of colonisation. And it's my view from my research that there's a direct line between that violent process of colonisation, settlement, invasion, and the high rates of incarceration and bad outcomes we see for Indigenous people today. And police play a very key role in that.
You've used the language there of police being in the front line and note in the submission the role of the laws themselves, the courts and prosecutors there. Could you just explain how it is that police are the gatekeepers or the front line to the criminal justice system, and explain what you mean by police discretion and targeting?
Yes, so police are the first point of contact for people with the criminal justice system. Police create the first impression of the criminal justice system, and police are very powerful in terms of who's pulled into the criminal justice system. Police discretion, for example, is broad enough so that they can target people based on the way they look, so that identity becomes quite central to who is police, not necessarily what a person does, but how they're identified as a person or part of a community that is criminalised. So police can target areas where Indigenous people or First Nations people congregate. They can target the behaviours that First Nations people engage in, and they can target people based on how they look. So pull over cars driven by Indigenous people, frequent areas, or police more heavily areas where Indigenous people live or congregate. And when linked to this idea of accountability too, when there is not a strong oversight of police, those things can happen without remedy. But also, once someone's pulled into the criminal justice system through targeting by police, being over-policed as a community or as people who identify as Indigenous or identified, it's very hard to marshal the resources to contest what is seen as criminal or called criminal activity. So that's called criminalisation. And laws like the public drunkenness laws, for example, that have recently been repealed, can be used in a way that really criminalise Indigenous people. A lot of offences are what's called street offences, where there's no victims and the only person who's the complainant is the police. So it can really be a system set into motion by the police, the criminalisation, and a system that's very hard to intervene in when the police are the subject.
So I take it from your answer that it can be deliberate in terms of the allocation of resources, so that certain areas or populations are policed more than other areas. It can be deliberate in terms of the way police exercise their discretion, or it could also be unconscious in terms of the biases operating within individual police officers as to who they target and how they exercise their discretion, whether to caution, charge, or...
Exactly.
yeah.
So it can be systematic and systematised, as you say, in targeting particular areas, for example, and it can be racism on the part of particular police. It can be the view that Indigenous identities equal criminality, the easy criminalisation, but it can also be unconscious bias.
What's the consequence of that practice, systemic and what we might call conscious or unconscious biases operating? What's the consequence for First Nations people in their dealings with police?
The consequences are the continuing violation of human rights, the reproduction of Indigenous identities as criminal identities, so that rather than being seen as First Peoples who have a call on the nation states in terms of human rights and historic injustice, but simply being criminals. And we know that many First Nations people are dragged into the criminal justice system at a very early age. So it really narrows the life choices of people, or the ability to move through life in a way that people can meet their aspirations. And it compounds trauma and it compounds inequality. And we know there are underlying issues related to colonisation with trauma, around education, around poverty and unemployment. But all of those things are can be a product of the criminalisation, or they can be compounded by the criminalisation. And also, of course, child removal issues or child protection issues can also be brought into play. So it can impact on whole families.
Much of your life's work has been examining these issues. Do you have any view about what motivates the persistence of these issues?
That's a really big question and a really good question. I think in some ways in many ways it's historical. And it's a continuation of colonisation and those colonial relations of power. It's political, and I think that part of it, and part of what we want to focus on, is the ability to get away with it too. So the lack of accountability, it won't solve the problem, but it's a necessary step, because if a police force can treat a minority community in coercive, violent, racist, prejudiced ways without any consequences or substantive consequences, then that's one of the things that perpetuates it. And the criminalisation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once someone has a criminal record, then people are started, if in First Nations people are overrepresented in prisons and the like, they start to be identified as criminals.
So you're talking about impunity there of police. Does it also affect the trust of First Nations people in policing and their ability to engage, or their willingness to engage with police?
Absolutely. First Nations people have very low trust in policing, but linked to that, very low trust in the accountability complaints mechanisms that exist, a feeling like they're not independent and that there is very little hope of any justice or redress, both in terms of the systematic or systemic issues and for individual complainants.
In page 6 of the submission, if I could just read you this paragraph, or the opening of this paragraph. While Victorian First Peoples and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout Australia are over-policed as potential offenders or targeted by police based on their identity as First Peoples, they are also underserviced, punished and criminalised as victims. So do I take it that you are saying there is undersurfacing on the one hand and then a response by police that assumes First People represent a risk of criminal behaviour warranting intervention on the other?
Yes, so Indigenous or First Nations people are over-policed as potential offenders or targeted, and they're under-policed as victims. When they look for services from police for protection, they don't get that. So it doesn't. So the lack of faith in police isn't just limited to people who might come into contact with police as potential offenders, but also people who, and particularly First Nations women who might want to call police, might want their services to protect them from particularly sexual assaults and family violence.
Is it your evidence that the state, through the police force, are essentially criminalising social and economic disadvantage of First Nations people?
Yes, but I think it goes further than that too, because while I think that that's part of it, I don't think that being a First Nations person is a risk factor in relation to police, in relation to being targeted by police. I think if you're well off financially and you have all the trappings of respectability, white respectability, then you're inoculated to some extent, but you're not. You can still be targeted based on your identity as an Aboriginal person, First Nations person.
Yeah. And finally, for this group of questions I was going to ask you, what's the impact of that on the trust in police and police oversight in Victoria?
Well, recent surveys have said that the trust in police in Victoria is declining, and since records or surveys have been done, it's at a low. But there is an absolute connection between trust in police and trust in the oversight system. Everyone will accept that amongst 10,000, 20,000 police and thousands and hundreds of thousands of interactions with the public, there's going to be some problems. No one expects a system that involves humans to be perfect, but you do want a system where there's misconduct, serious misconduct, excessive use of force, violations of people's human rights, that to be rectified and minimised. So when you have a system where people have enormous powers, like the police do, over individuals' rights, their human rights, and can use those powers up to and including deadly force, if there's no robust accountability, that's going to affect how you see the police and the whole system. If something happens, you want to know that that's really aberrant within the organisation. It's not systemic. But what's happening, I would argue, is there's systemic problems. They're not aberrations. And the systemic problems remain mitigated because there isn't, one of the reasons is there's a lack of accountability.
Excuse me, Professor McCullough, are there any figures, are there any data that talk about how, that actually talk about First Nations levels of trust in police? Have there been any surveys done to collect that sort of information?
I know that the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service has done a submission on police accountability. I think that has some figures in it, and they certainly say that the level of trust amongst Indigenous First Nations people is very low. My experience is it's extremely low, but I can't point to any figures offhand.
Dr. Maguire, if I can turn to you and jump around a little in the submission to around page 10, the development of the police ombudsman model in Northern Ireland. Could you share with commissioners your views as to whether there are parallels in Northern Ireland and the situation in Victoria?
Well, I think one of the big issues driving the establishment of the Police Ombudsman's Office in Northern Ireland was a lack of confidence in policing. As we emerged from the conflict, called Troubles, and we entered into a political process of reform and moving towards the peace process, one of the key issues was in relation to policing and how to address the issue of a substantial segment of the population which had mistrust in policing from a Catholic nationalist point of view, who had at times little faith in the Royal Constabulary and the way in which they policed the community. So as part of the reform agenda, part of the peace process, there were two elements which were important to address this issue of community confidence.
Sorry, you're cutting in and out a little bit, Doctor. I was just going to mention that the feed is not perfect, so sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No, as I was saying, one of the issues of reform was the pattern report into policing. From the Royal Constabulary to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, where the focus of the police service should be on community policing. And this was a direct attempt to increase public confidence in the police service. The second and related dimension to that was the establishment of much greater police accountability. And that led to the setting up of the Police Ombudsman's Office in 2000, where as part of the change agenda, the office was to improve and develop police accountability and thereby generate greater community trust and greater community confidence in policing. So I think one of the big issues in terms of parallel is the attempt to improve community confidence, which obviously is an issue in Victoria, but was one of the direct features which led to the establishment of Poland.
I think Dr. Maguire's... sorry, if I'm pausing there just to make sure you are finished. Just so we understand, for those unfamiliar with the history of the Northern Ireland conflict, could you just explain to us the role of the Royal Ulster Constabulary in that conflict and then the peace process that followed, the importance of police accountability to that peace process?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the police service was, policing in Northern Ireland was a heavily contested space. There was a legitimate perception that the Royal Constabulary was a representative of the Unionist state and that it policed inadequately the Catholic community. And in many cases, parallel what Jude was talking about in relation to over-policing and underserving the Catholic nationalist community in Northern Ireland. And as part of the policing reform agenda, it was important to establish much greater community confidence in policing. So the reform agenda of police, the transition from the Royal Constabulary to the police service in Northern Ireland, with a much greater focus on community policing, was a direct attempt to address that as an issue. But it was seen as an important parallel exercise that much greater accountability of policing had to be part of that agenda. So the design of polling, and one of the particular design components of the Police Ombudsman's Office was that it dealt with all public complaints against police, that this was felt to be an important dimension of improving community confidence in policing. So you had a policing as a contested space, you had a police reform agenda, but as part of that process, you had the desire to improve and to generate much greater police accountability, so that many of the issues which, from a community point of view, were felt to be inadequate had to be addressed as part of the police accountability agenda.
Okay. You touched there on lack of confidence in police and accountability. Before the PONI was established, the Police Ombudsman was established, could you tell us what problems there were with complaints handling?
Well, there was a police complaints body in Northern Ireland, but its profile was pretty low. And when people did bring complaints to it, the substantiation rates, again, were pretty low, around about 2%. So there was little faith in the police complaints process. That led to things. It led to people not bringing complaints against the police because they felt they wouldn't be adequately addressed. But it also dealt with the issue of accountability within policing, because in many cases, misdemeanours or misconduct in policing weren't addressed properly because there wasn't an adequate mechanism for dealing with complaints against police.
Do I understand from what you were saying there was a lack of faith in police and police oversight systems?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Morris Hedge report, which led to the establishment of the Police Ombudsman's Office, clearly highlights the problems with the existing police complaints mechanisms. And it had to do, as I say, with the low profile, the failure to substantiate complaints on a substantive basis, and in relation to the extent to which there was little confidence as a result in the police complaints process.
So before the Police Ombudsman was established, were those review mechanisms independent of police?
They were independent on paper, but in reality, they actually dealt with very few complaints against the police. The majority of complaints were dealt by the police themselves. It would be what we call a hybrid model, where there was oversight, in inverted commas, of police complaints, but in actuality, the extent to which there was independent investigations was very little.
I just want to touch on the key reports or catalysts that you mention in your submission. The first is the report of Morris Hayes that's noted in the submission at page 10 of 1977. What was the importance of that report into inadequacies in the system that time?
Well, Morris Hayes was a distinguished public servant. He was the Public Services Ombudsman in Northern Ireland. He was asked to address specifically the issue of police accountability. And one of the key messages from his report, when he spoke to politicians, he spoke to community representatives, he outreached a whole range of areas in relation to their views on policing and policing accountability. The key theme that emerged was that of independence. In fact, he says specifically in the report, independence, independence, independence is the cornerstone and the bedrock against which police accountability should be addressed. And therefore, his recommendation was the establishment of a completely statutorily independent organisation, independent of the police, independent of the Department of Justice and other justice organisations, whose job would be to address complaints from the public in a manner which was out with the policing service.
The next report you mention is the Patten Commission report, which endorsed Hayes' proposal to establish a police ombudsman with a number of recommendations. And
yes, the Patten report that there shouldn't a piecemeal approach to police reform. I think he says in the report that this wasn't something, police reform wasn't something that could be bolted onto the existing policing organisation, but rather he called for a holistic reform of the police service. That led to symbolic changes from the uniform and the cap badge, but also a change of name, but also substantive change to the nature of policing itself in terms of recommendations. And he recognised that as part of that change agenda, it was important to improve police accountability. So he endorsed the Morris Hedge recommendations, and the recommendations put forward by his about the need for independence, that the complaints would be decided by a police ombudsman's office, that they would decide how to investigate those complaints, that they would generate information across the policing service which could be used to improve police operations, and therefore it was a key element, a key piece of the jigsaw of overall police reform.
in addition to independence, You've mentioned a number of other key design recommendations that Patton made, including that the body be proactive, resourced, able to analyse data and trends, to have a dynamic cooperative relationship with key stakeholders, broad scope to enable it to address systemic issues, and the ability to look back at past reports and complaints. Were these features recommended by Patton ultimately found their way into the pony?
Yes, they did. And I think one issue of context, I should say, though, is that this was part of an overall change in the police accountability mechanisms. It established the police authority, which had politicians and lay members to oversee the policing plan and the implementation of the policing plan, and appointed the chief constable independently of the Department of Justice. It also established the criminal justice reform, established the criminal justice inspectorate, which had inspection responsibilities into policing. And as part of that jigsaw, the Police Ombudsman's Office of Northern Ireland was established as well. So the issues identified by Patton and by Maurice Hayes were baked into the design of the Police Ombudsman's Office, so that it dealt with all public complaints against the police, that the legislation said that the police must give information to the Police Ombudsman, that the Police Ombudsman could, on his own initiative, undertake investigations into policing. Those reports could be published, and that the information would be generated on police complaints, which could be used from a customer service point of view to identify problem areas and to allow both the police and the police authority to make decisions about how to improve the nature of the relationship between the police and the community.
Could you just explain how the authority, the inspectorate and the ombudsman work and how they interact?
Yeah, well, I was also the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice, so I had different kinds of relationships with all three organisations. Really, it was a triangle. I mean, as a Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice, for example, in my 4.5-year tenure, I produced around 70 reports across the justice system, because my responsibilities weren't just policing, it was also the Public Prosecution Service, Courts Administration, prisons and probation and some other bodies, as well as the Police Ombudsman's Office. In relation to policing, I would have given my reports to the police authority, both strategic recommendations and operational recommendations. They then would have engaged with the police as part of the change programme and to follow up on the implementation of those recommendations. I also did follow-up reports myself as Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice. And as Police Ombudsman, I would have also attended meetings on a regular basis of the policing authority. I would have given published profiles of the complaints process by district in Northern Ireland, by nature of complaints, plotted changes over time. And that would have fed into the police authority's discussions about a complaints reduction strategy with the police service. And so the three organisations, when they worked together, was about greater accountability, but it was also about performance improvement within policing to ensure that these recommendations were implemented.
You mentioned in the submission that a relevant consideration was also the British Human Rights Act and obligations arising in Northern Ireland under the European Convention on Human Rights. How did that influence the design process and the considerations that were taken into account?
Well, I think there are two dimensions to that. One was in relation to the Police Ombudsman's Office. When we were undertaking investigations into serious criminal activity, quite often where there was death after contact with the police, we would have tried to ensure that the process that we used met Article 2 in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 2, the right to life. There was a set of issues which needed to be addressed in order to meet the Article 2 agenda in terms of an independent investigation of the state, reports which are open to public scrutiny, engagement with families and so on. So we tried to develop that as part of our own methodology. In relation to policing, it was a much broader set where the human rights articles were baked into the nature of policing itself. So if we take custody situation, for example, Article 8, the right to privacy, the need to avoid inhumane treatment in policing, Article 2 in terms of investigations, they were built into the Policing Code of Ethics so that there was a a human rights basis to the nature of policing and the way in which their activities were generated. And that was overseen by a human rights advisor to the police authority, who did a regular report to the police authority on human rights within policing and the way in which was being implemented within the organisation. So it was part of the focus of the ethics of policing and the way in which that translated into operational activity, but then became part of the oversight mechanisms as well, where the human rights advisor, who incidentally was Sir Keir Starmer for a period of 6 years, who's now the Labour leader in the UK, he was the human rights advisor to the police authority. So it was a central element to the nature of the policing and the design of the new police service of Northern Ireland.
Could you share with the Commission some of your early experiences with the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland, the Pony, and how you overcame early challenges?
Well, when I was the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice, I was asked to undertake an inspection into the Police Ombudsman's office. The Chief Executive had resigned, and he said in his resignation letter that he felt the independence of the office had been compromised, particularly in relation to legacy work, that's investigations into troubles-related matters and policing. I did an inspection into the office of the Police Ombudsman, and my conclusions, unfortunately, were that the independence of the office had been compromised, that reports were buffeted between policing, the police organisation themselves, between families, NGOs and lawyers, and that there was at times a failure to maintain the independence of the office when it came to the production of sensitive investigations. That report was presented to the Police Ombudsman. There was a series. What I recommended was, for example, that legacy reports should cease until they were properly resourced and a change programme had been implemented in relation to the design of those investigations. A number of months later, completely coincidentally, I found myself in the role of Police Ombudsman, and I had to implement my own recommendations in that regard. So part of that was the development of a greater quality assurance process, both with legacy reports and current investigations, and also developing a different relationship with stakeholders, the Department of Justice, the police service, non-governmental organisations, families, lawyers and representatives and so on. So that became part of my change agenda when I became the Police Ombudsman in my early days.
And so what was the most important features of tackling those early challenges? How did you go about it?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think the issue which obviously had led to my arrival in the office was that of independence. And therefore I had to, in the activities, or sorry, in the nature of my engagement with the various stakeholders, I had to be very clear that while I was there to listen to what they had to say, while I was there to obtain any information that they had, ultimate decisions around independence and the conclusions of investigations were my own, and that would be the case, and that they would not be able to influence the conclusions that I came to. So establishing the independence of the office, independent of the Department of Justice, I developed a protocol which made it very clear that while I was accountable to the Department of Justice for resourcing, that the Minister and the Department had absolutely no role whatsoever in relation to the investigations and the conclusions of those investigations. I established much more formal communications with the police, both at a strategic and an operational level, which made it very clear that they would be asked to, for example, factual accuracy check reports, but that would be it. They weren't there to influence the conclusions of the reports themselves. And also I said to families, I said, look, I will bring you with us in terms of the investigative process, but I will not in any way be influenced by your own particular narrative in relation to the conclusions of my reports itself. So it was about establishing a new role for the office, establishing the fact that it was independent of all of the range of stakeholders, and that then was subject to external review. The Criminal Justice Inspectorate did an inspection into the office while I was there. They said that the independence of the office had been restored, and also the reports from non-governmental organisations like Amnesty International, they were confident that the independence of the office had been restored in that regard. So it was about improving quality assurance, it was about developing a different relationship with stakeholders, and it was about demonstrating that we, without fear or favour, would both criticise the police, but also necessary, and it was necessary to say actually there was no misconduct or criminality within the police itself, and make sure that those conclusions were published widely in order to reinforce the fact that this was an independent investigation into policing activity.
Can I just ask, were you reporting to government? Were you reporting to executive, to the parliament, elected members of parliament?
My accountability relationship was with the Department of Justice. My chief executive was the accounting officer for the office, who had responsibility for the management of the resources. So that was the direct line, as it was. I held regular meetings with the Minister for Justice, but that was simply at a strategic level to talk about the issues in the office itself. There were times when I went public to criticise the Minister for the failure to resource adequately. I felt the office and the investigations that we were doing. I didn't report directly to the Northern Ireland Assembly, although ultimately they were accountable for the office and the work that we did. But at the same time, I could easily have been called. In fact, in my chief inspector role, I was regularly in front of the Justice Committee to talk about the work that we did. Okay. Interestingly, one of the current ombudsman, one of the recommendations that she's made is that the Office of the Police Ombudsman should not report to the Department of Justice for reasons of independence, but indeed should report to the Assembly in much the same way as the Ombudsman's Office does in Northern Ireland.
And in your time, at least, was there ever an issue with the Department of Justice or the appropriate minister seeking to suppress your reports or recommendations?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I mean, no minister would have dared try to influence the Ombudsman's Office in the reports that it did.
If that had occurred, did you have power to speak publicly?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And would have done.
Okay. Could you just share, before we leave this topic, how the pony works with the coroner and other parallel investigative bodies?
Yeah. Going back to context, we had the establishment of a police reform agenda, which was about the transition to the police service of Northern Ireland. We had the establishment of independent police oversight mechanisms. But there was a much wider criminal justice reform in Northern Ireland, which established other independent organisations, not only the likes of the Criminal Justice Inspectorate, but also an independent public prosecution service. The coroner service was already independent. So if we think about the criminal justice process, if we were dealing with criminality, for example, the Police Ombudsman's Office would have produced a report into the criminal activity of individual police officers. That report would have gone to Public Prosecution Service, who decided independently whether or not to prosecute that officer. If there was prosecution, a decision was made, then it went through the criminal justice system. If there was a death in custody, the coroner's inquest, the Police Ombudsman's Office inquiry into that death in custody would have formed evidence to the coroner's inquiry. We would have also taken evidence from other stakeholders as well. So our investigation into that inquiry would have performed part of the coroner's inquest. Thank you.
Can I come back to the topic of police oversight in Victoria and ask you both to respond to these questions? You say in the submission, the history of inquiries into policing and police accountability in Victoria is one of scandal and conflict. In your submission, can I invite you both or either of you to expand on that?
Yes, well, there has been the system that we've got for oversight.
Jude, do you want to answer that first?
I think there's just a lag on the, yep.
I'll start, Michael, then. There's been a history, a long history of there being scandals in policing and then reform to the oversight system responding to those scandals, but in a piecemeal way without any view to a sustainable reform or reform that is substantive. We won't go through all the scandals, but one or two recent ones. There's the Lawyer X scandal that led to the Royal Commission. If we'd had a robust independent oversight mechanism, it's arguable that that would never have got to that stage where the High Court said that police had behaved reprehensibly, and there was subsequently the Royal Commission. And another incident that's particularly relevant here today, I think, is in 2018, the then head of the Professional Standards Command in Victoria Police, which is responsible for investigating complaints, was found to have used a pseudonym to make highly offensive, racist and homophobic posts about people. So this is the history that we've got of revelations of problems, scandals that are so big in some cases they can't be overlooked. And then there's some response, but it's not a systematic response.
Dr. Maguire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not an unusual pattern. When you look at police oversight across the world, what you see quite often is a crisis response approach where institutions or organisations are established in response to particular issues rather than a more strategic view as to what we want in terms of police oversight and how that relates to policing. The point about you made in relation to Lawyer X is an interesting one because it says something about, for example, when we look at the powers of the Police Ombudsman's Office in Northern Ireland, where we had direct access to information concerning informers and the use of informers. And in terms of the reports, a number of reports that I did and indeed the office has done over the years, we looked directly at the use of police informers, the way in which they were engaged in criminality, in certain cases the way they were protected from justice, and the way in which that led to some quite horrendous incidences of murder and so on. So it was one of the tension points that I had with policing was that I was very clear that in relation to the public, there is no area of a policing activity which was out with the remit of the office. Because I and my team were vetted to top secret levels, we did have access to some very sensitive information because it was important as part of the investigations that we did that we had full access. And there was one particular occasion where I had to threaten to judicially review the police because of their failure to give access to information. And I remember saying at the time that investigation by negotiation wasn't an option in that regard. So looking at the powers of the office and thinking back to the situation that we have in Victoria, you not only have a limited oversight mechanism which deals with a very few range of complaints, but actually the access to information that you have does seem to be problematic.
You identify a number of key reports in the submission, page 8 and onwards, including the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody back in 1991, so more than 30 years ago, a couple of parliamentary inquiries in 2016 and 18 into external police oversight of police corruption and misconduct in Victoria, and an audit of complaints conducted by IBAC in 2022. And you mentioned, Professor, the Royal Commission into the Management of Police Informants. We understand that there was a government review in 2021-2022 by the government to a systemic review of police oversight as a result of that Royal Commission and the recommendation 61 particularly of that Royal Commission. We don't have that published yet. I'm not aware that that's come to hand, and no doubt we will have an opportunity to ask government officials and ministers about that review in due course. But are there key findings of those reports that are relevant to the Commission today that you would like to emphasise?
Well, of the 2018 parliamentary inquiry, they made 69 recommendations about reform of the system. They said it was very complex system, it wasn't very transparent. They pointed out a lot of problems. One key recommendation they made was that all serious misconduct cases be investigated by IBAC, the independent body, rather than the police. So at the moment, the police investigate 98% of cases, complaints. But we and Michael and I have spoken about this, and we've spoken to key stakeholders, don't think that that goes far enough. And there are a few reasons for that. It would just be another reform, a tacking on of something in a system that we say is already too complex and not fit for purpose, broken. And the second one is, it's unlikely, I think, that that would address the problem of First Nations people. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that probably excessive use of force, which is the major problem that First Nations people complain about, what they most often complain about, wouldn't necessarily be categorised as serious misconduct. Because when you look at what the police, how the police and IBAC categorise complaints at the moment, excessive use of force is often not seen as a serious misconduct. And also it appears from the work of particularly the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service and other research that's been done earlier, that First Nations people have more serious complaints in the way that VALS views them than non-Aboriginal people, but they're more likely to complain than non-Aboriginal people of being assaulted. There's more proportion of those complaints. So we say a corruption body is not appropriate as a police complaints mechanism, but particularly inappropriate when we're looking at use of force, excessive use of force, deaths after police contact. That's not what we understand as corruption. A corruption body isn't oriented towards that. And I just wanted to say, I'm not sure if you want me to talk about it here, but the audit, the 2022 audit, I think that that's a really important piece of work that IBAC has done. And they looked into 41 complainants and 63 complaints that had been put in by First Nations people in Victoria that were closed in 2018. And it's actually quite stunning. They found that, they found there was, by reviewing the files, that there was bias on the part of the officers who were subject to the complaint against the complainants. They found that the officers who were investigating were not impartial. They found a really high level of conflict of interest, and by that I don't just mean police investigating police who work together investigating each other or who were in the same service area. And the thing that I found most alarming is they found that in the majority of cases, most cases, that the investigation was inadequate. That is, that the police who were investigating did not look at CCT footage, didn't take witness statements or didn't take them into account, and didn't look at the medical evidence, which is very important when assaults are involved. And I think it's also important to take into account and to think about that all these problems that the audit that IBAC did found happened under the current system where IBAC is oversighting. So their system, the system we've got now, produced those problems. The audit doesn't address those problems in that it doesn't say, all right, justice for these individual complainants who didn't have their complaints properly investigated. It only makes recommendations. And you can see by the way it's written, they've made these recommendations or similar ones before, but they haven't been acted on. And two, some of the recommendations are like, police haven't investigated these complaints properly. They need to be trained in investigations. Well, aren't they investigators? And isn't the problem the lack of isn't the problem bias, impartiality and conflict of interest? Isn't that lack of independence? And doesn't the very, in my opinion, and Michael shares it, the lack of robust independence of IBAC has allowed this to happen and cannot rectify it?
Can I invite you both to comment on these findings of that 1922 report, Victoria Police Handling of Complaints Made by Aboriginal Peoples, conducted by IBAC. IBAC highlights that Aboriginal young people and Aboriginal men are 6 times more likely than their non-Aboriginal peers to be processed by police as alleged offenders and 11 times more likely for Aboriginal women. High contact rates are recognised as being a consequence of colonisation and historic discriminatory laws and policies. Due to this experience of historic racial bias, many First Peoples continue to hold the view that the police are interested in controlling them rather than protecting and upholding their rights and interests. And the research shows Aboriginal people in Victoria believe they're subject to over-policing and that constant police scrutiny and checks can lead to harassment and repeated house visits without explanation. So can I invite you both to reflect on those findings of the IBAC report?
Well, I would say that reflects the perspective of people, particularly Indigenous people who make complaints, and amongst lawyers, particularly criminal lawyers, and also particularly lawyers and community workers often who come in contact with Indigenous people.
Dr. Maguire?
Well, I think it's a pretty good summary of the nature of the relationship between police and First Peoples. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about looking at the situation of Victoria and the way in which there have been numerous reports over the years is that I question where the appetite for change is. Powerless groups, vulnerable groups, people that have contact with the state are, as citizens, less powerful than those lobbies that want to maintain the status quo. The police, by their very nature, don't like change. Police unions don't like change. I wonder whether there's a political appetite for change itself. I always felt in my role as police ombudsman that I was a link between the citizen and much more powerful organisations, that I was able to ask questions on their behalf, which they couldn't do because of their vulnerable status. I don't see an appetite for change, police change in Victoria, and police oversight change in Victoria, and that is borne out by the lack of implementation of recommendations over the years. You look at the IBAC, I mean, the excruciating report that IBAC did on how the police treat Aboriginal people. Where's the conclusions of that? What has happened? Whenever there's a death in custody and police officers are found to have behaved inappropriately, where is the disciplinary sanctions that come out of that? How are they published? All of those things contribute to a lack of confidence in the police and how they deal with activities. And that was one of the reasons why, when I did do a report, it was very important that those reports were published. I investigated the Chief Constable and the senior team for criminal activity. It was very important when I came to the conclusion that there was nothing to see here, that report was published. When I investigated the allegation that an individual had been beaten to death while police officers stood by and watched it, it was very important that my investigation's conclusion that that didn't happen was published at the same time when I found that the police had acted inappropriately, where there were officers that needed to be disciplined. Again, that needed to be published. And officers were held accountable for their behaviour. You know, aside from whatever the motivation of bad behaviour is, one of the factors you need to consider is people will behave badly if they can get away with it. And a lack of oversight, a lack of accountability, does lead to officers behaving in ways that they should, irrespective of what their motivations are. So stronger accountability, as Jude said at the beginning, is not will not solve the problem, but it is part of the jigsaw that you need to put in place to ensure that those who are vulnerable are treated in a way which is respectful of their human rights.
Just to hone in on the current Victorian model, the two key institutions or bodies responsible for police oversight are Victoria Police itself, in terms of the Police Conduct Unit. The Chief Commissioner has power under the Victorian Police Act to receive and investigate police complaints, works through a professional standards command and a chain of command through to the regions, and must refer a complaint of corruption to IBAC. And then we have the IBAC, which is a standalone body, as you mentioned, established to investigate corruption and misconduct of police and protective services. But as you mentioned, Professor, the IBAC ends up referring matters back, so that I think you said 98% of complaints are dealt with by police themselves.
Correct.
And IBAC is primarily established as a corruption body, although it also deals with misconduct of police. Then there are other bodies that might deal with unlawful discrimination on the basis of race, like our Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission or the Australian Human Rights Commission, or other bodies dealing with misconduct of one sort or another. But they're the principal organs, being the police themselves and the IBAC. Can I just mention to you from the website of IBAC, its powers to investigate, I'm summarising here, under the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission Act of 2011. IBAC has the power to investigate human rights breaches, use of force, discrimination, misuse of information, a range of specific offences and conflicts of interest. It can do so of its own motion. It has powers of examination, including some limited or exceptional powers of public examination. It can undertake research to consider thematic or systemic issues, as it did with its audit in 2022, or in the case of Operation Ross concerning Ballarat Police Station, for example. And it can pursue public education. And it can also refer complaints of serious misconduct back to Victoria Police. And as I understand what you were saying, it apparently does that in most cases, if the percentages are right.
Yes, according to the 2018 parliamentary inquiry, 98% of complaints are investigated by police.
So this is what we call a mixed civilian model. To cut to the chase, what is the problem with a body established to investigate corruption also investigating police misconduct that may or may not be corrupt in nature?
Well, I think there's another fundamental question or issue, and that is the powers of this corruption body, anti-corruption body. It can investigate complaints against the police, but almost always it doesn't. Because 98% of them go back to police. It can review the complaints, or it does review and monitor the complaints that police investigate. But as we saw from the 2022 audit, it can't rectify, or it doesn't rectify, the problems that it occurs. And a review won't tell the IBAC what hasn't been investigated necessarily, or what's missing. There might be some indication of it, but it's clear from that 2022 review that all those things occur even though IBAC is overviewing. They can request information from the police, but they can't demand it, as in the case of Pony. They can recommend, but their recommendations are not necessarily taken up. And with Pony, they often are. If there is criminal conduct too, it's a very complex system, and the 2018 parliamentary inquiry has got like a model of how it works that you need to be some engineering genius to work through. It's so complex. They can publish reports, but as Michael's pointing out, nowhere near to the extent that something like Pony does. They can collect data, but it's such a fragmented system, the data just isn't there, so it's quite opaque.
So is it just a case of tweaking the powers of IBAC here, would that be good enough to give them additional powers, additional resources to look at police misconduct? Or is it your view that we need to move to the independent ombudsman model?
I think we need to move to the independent ombudsman model. It's recognised as the gold standard around the world. Pony is an example that's looked to as an ideal model. It's also a model that has assisted with a process of treaty, basically the peace process in Northern Ireland. It's achieved much more than anyone would have expected in terms of building community confidence in a police force that was reviled by many in the Catholic community, and for good reasons in many cases. There's many reasons, but the other thing is that IBAC is part of a discredited system now in relation to investigating police complaints. We can tack something else on there, but it needs a fundamental reset, particularly for First Nations people, where the confidence and the confidence in police, it's not just the confidence in police, let's face it, it's the experience which leads to the confidence. The experience of colonialisation, the history of colonial violence, which is continuing today with police on the front line. So I would say that this is once in a generation, more than a generation, it's a real opportunity for real change. It will be costly financially, but the cost of doing nothing will be higher. There's civil action, but it's more about democracy and civil actions against the police, which will no doubt continue diversion under this system where the state has to pay out money, but it's human rights and democracy. A change in the system is so important for First Nations people, but it's important for every citizen, every person living in Victoria. And as Michael's pointed out, it's important for police too, because police need to be a professional service and get the feedback from this complaint system, accurate feedback. It should be that these things that happen are an aberration and they can be stopped, not that they become embedded.
Dr Maguire, can I ask for your insight and reflections?
I think this is, and I endorse what Judith said, and the importance of independent oversight to improve and engage with greater community confidence in policing. I mean, the problem with IBAC is, and this isn't to criticise individuals in IBAC, it isn't to criticise the work that they do or indeed bring in any way question their integrity, but it is about recognising that there are structural flaws in how you currently deal with police complaints, institutional flaws. If you have an organisation that in real terms is only investigating in the region, it doesn't matter whether it's 2% or 6%, the vast majority of complaints are investigated by the police themselves. What that means is you're giving false assurance of the independent investigations of complaints. Because if you're an individual that's in Victoria and you want to make a complaint against the police, you have in the vast majority of cases, that complaint is going to be investigated by another police officer. If your starting point is a lack of confidence in policing, how can you possibly have confidence in the police complaints process if it's going to be investigated by another police officer? So the fact that you have an organisation which on paper looks very similar to the Police Ombudsman's Office in terms of publication of reports, the way in which it can get information from the police and so on. But when you dig below that, when you get to a different level of analysis, and you realise that in the vast majority of cases, the police will investigate themselves, how can you, as a community, have confidence in that if you have mistrust in the police based on your lived experience? How can you possibly have confidence that conversation, that investigation is going to be done independently? And as we've seen with the IBAC report, into looking at how complaints by First Peoples are investigated, that lack of confidence and trust is actually born into reality, because you have conflicts of interest, you have a failure to investigate, you have labelling people in a way which mistrust their evidence as part of the investigative process. All of those things lead to an outcome which is inadequate for the individual making the complaint, and I think is inadequate for Victorian society, which believes that it has the independent investigation of complaints, believes that that assurance is there. But in reality, when you get into the detail, that is not the case, and there's false assurance that police complaints are investigated independently. In reality, when you look across the spectrum from the old time of internal affairs, that was discredited. So you have a spectrum of hybrid models, and different countries are placed somewhere along that spectrum. The police ombudsman's model is at the other end of that spectrum, which has deals with all public complaints against the police. They are independently investigated. Those reports are, in serious cases, are published widely. They have police officers have the powers of a police officer. We can arrest individual officers. We can search their property. We can search their homes, and we can publish the outcomes of those investigations. Those are the building blocks of design, I think, which are important in developing community confidence. But it's not only that. It's about engagement, it's about outreach, it's about showing that there's a different way of doing things. Because if you don't have that, then people will continue to have a lack of confidence in the system.
I might ask you if we can step through the design features that you regard as gold standard, and you set out a number of features relevant to Pony at page 27, and just to touch on each of these, and then to invite Dr. McCulloch, you particularly to comment from a Victorian perspective, if we can go through this list. First, you identify as institutional independence from the police. And so I take it, Dr. McCulloch, you would say that a system that involves referral back of a vast majority of complaints back to police does not achieve that independence?
I agree.
Yeah. Dr. Maguire, do you want to say anything more about the requirement of independence? I know you've emphasised that as being the basis of the Hayes recommendation and pattern subsequently, and your work, your own experience. Anything to add to
I think
that?
it's critical. Yeah, if so in the police complaints process, they have to put it and that means real independence, both in terms of the organisation, how it's financed, the legislative base that underpins it, and the people that are doing the investigations themselves, and indeed what the outcomes of the reports are.
You just touched on the second, which is that they investigate all public complaints, so that's criminal and non-criminal behaviour, into police from the minor to the serious. Why is that important?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, from what we talked about in relation to independence, it's important because people can have confidence that the police complaints organisation deals with all aspects of policing in that regard, and that investigation will be carried out independently. It's important in relation to the information base that can be collected, because you're dealing with all public complaints, you can develop quite a sophisticated understanding of the nature of complaints, the nature of where those complaints are being made, the district, down to individual officer level. There were occasions, for example, when I was able to show to senior police officers that certain response teams in Belfast had double and treble the number of complaints of other response teams in the same area, response being the first responder in a way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but it does raise questions as to why that's the case. And it's important because it's part of the rationale of the organisation that it deals with all public complaints. It doesn't mean, the police had their own internal corruption unit. They obviously dealt with internal disciplinary matters themselves, but public complaints were dealt with by the police. So if there was an incident involving police officers, the police themselves said, this is now a matter for independent investigation. whether it be a death after a car chase, for example, where the police were pursuing a car and the car crashed and an individual was killed. That caused quite a lot of community issues in terms of the nature of the police response to that incident. The police were able to say, look, this is now subject to independent investigation. And that's the same with all serious cases. So the investigating all aspects of public complaints, yes, it is expensive, but it is important and was important in part of this dealing with the nature of the independence. And there was quite a debate around this when Maurice Hayes did his report. And certainly they were very clear, Pony has to has to investigate all public complaints, because the issues of community confidence were so bad that was the only way that we were able to move forward in policing. That all public complaints would be investigated independently.
The next issue is complete control over the complaints process. Can I, and you expand on that, can I offer you this summary? Often in inquests in Victoria, a single department of government takes the lead, responding to a coroner for a death in custody, for example, to give a whole of government response. And this would appear to plainly create a process where a single body is acting as the gatekeeper for the government response. How they're to respond, what issues they're to respond to, and which are to elevate in terms of their importance. And there is clearly a risk that's been identified that this is a way of potentially managing a response so that certain unpalatable features are downplayed and other features are emphasised. In terms of the whole of government responding in this manner, is there an advantage to having an independent ombudsman like the Pony taking control of that process so that there is not that ability to manage or downplay certain concerns by some groups of public servants and the preferencing of issues by the lead agency?
Well, I think it's important to say that the remit of Pony was only to look at the police. So if there was a death in custody, we would have investigated the policing activity in relation to that individual. And indeed, in my time of office, we had certainly we brought a custody sergeant was prosecuted for manslaughter. And another custody individual pleaded guilty to misconduct of public office because of a death in custody. But we only did the police investigation. We didn't look at other state agencies. We didn't look at other aspects of government. We only looked at the police and their activities and their behaviours in the context of death after contact with an individual. It was the coroner that could take a much broader view as to what was important in relation to the coronial inquest and so on. But we only looked at the individual policing activities in relation to any death in custody, or indeed any death after.
Understood, thank you. Professor McCulloch, do you have any view about how we establish a mechanism to get to the genuine root cause analysis of cause in cases that might involve police and others, corrections officers, protective services officers, for example, and how we ensure transparency of the system?
Well, I think I can only talk about the police accountability part of it, and I do believe that having an independent, robustly independent, substantially independent accountability mechanism is the way to address police conduct when there's police contact death, and perhaps police contact, perhaps when the police behaviour has led to the person being in non-police custody, that would be also something that should be investigated by the independent body.
So do I take it from both of your answers that there needs to be a communication mechanism or a collaboration mechanism so that other agencies like the Ombudsman, our public service Ombudsman, can be involved in a joint process or a collaborative process so that those, if other agencies are involved, they can be properly examined?
My own view would be, I think, when you look at serious incidents and how they occur, there's never one factor involved. Multiple state agencies can be involved. Can be multiple opportunities for something to change the direction of what happened. And I think any process which puts their arms around an incident and tries to unpick what happened as part of a series of steps, I think would be beneficial. From a police accountability point of view, independent investigation of the police and the impact that they had is a critical part of that. But quite often there are other agencies involved as well. And if that's part of the bringing together of a complete understanding of an issue, then I think that would be beneficial.
The other gold standard that you've mentioned appear self-evident. Is there any other comment you wish to make about those? Powers of police, Pony having the powers of police, transparency, separate cultural identity, and appointment by royal warrant to generate statutory independence. Is there anything you want to add to those features?
Well, I just kind of, I suppose, developing in a minor way. I mean, the royal warrant was important because, and I probably would say this, wouldn't I? I mean, the Ombudsman's job is one of the most difficult, I think, public service jobs in Northern Ireland, subject to, and I always took the view, in my interview with Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness, who were the first and Deputy First Minister at the time, I said to them, there will be an occasion where both of you will not like what I produce. And that's the nature of the office. So therefore, having an appointment under royal warrant, which can't be subject to the vagaries of any political influence or departmental influence, I think is hugely important in that regard. The transparency issue, I think, is also worth developing because one of the things which Pony has done, which does make it different from other oversight organisations, is that we develop quite a sophisticated mechanism for getting external views on the work of the office. We regularly surveyed police officers. We surveyed complaints. We surveyed members of the public about their views on Pony. We surveyed different categories within a population based on race, gender, and so on. So we had quite a sophisticated 360 view of Pony and the perceptions of it. Not all of them were favourable, but that's important to know in order to make operational changes. And not only the transparency in the operations of the office in terms of what people think about us, transparency in relation to the work that we do. So complainants got an individual letter detailing their allegation, the approach that was taken and the conclusions. Transparency in relation to the publication of serious incidents and what our conclusions were. And I think transparency in relation to data, information. If you want to improve something, you need the information to allow you to make decisions in relation to that. And so we had quite a sophisticated database which looked at complaints across Northern Ireland. That information was given to police as part of their own performance improvement. So the transparency in the operation of the office, I think, was quite important in that regard. The powers of the office, in terms of the powers of the police officer, I think were hugely important, not only from the point of view of parity of esteem, that my officers had the same status as a police officer, but actually was critical in undertaking criminal investigations. If there was an investigation into a serious police incident, my staff took over the scene. And we would say to families, we had a family liaison officer that said, this is now subject to independent investigation. The police themselves welcomed this because they knew from a community confidence point of view that it would be subject to independent investigation. And indeed, I remember when the Chief Constable was under investigation himself, his comment, as we wrote in our submission, which is, I have confidence in the police ombudsman, let him get on and do his job. And I think that was welcomed by the police because they knew there would be occasion whereby we would say there was nothing to see here. And in order for that to be accepted, they recognised that they would have to take it on the chin whenever we said there were serious misconduct issues involved. So that transparency issue was part of that agenda.
Professor McCulloch, our mechanisms include the inspector and parliamentary committee, which can, of course, examine the officers involved, that is the IBAC Commissioner and police, and the report of IBAC to the Parliament on its investigations and processes. What would you say to the Commission about the efficacy of our oversight mechanisms here in Victoria?
I think the oversight mechanisms for police are very weak, substantially, formally independent, but substantially not so. The power base that the IBAC has is weak compared to something like Pony. So here we don't have, IBAC doesn't have the powers of a police officer. Here they don't investigate 100% of complaints like they do in Northern Ireland. But importantly, criminality, if there's crimes to be investigated, that will be sent back to the police, generally. Am I answering your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Can I turn now to your recommendations at page 31 and step through them and invite your additional comment on any that you wish to expand on? The first is plainly the establishment of a new police oversight body that explicitly reflects the civilian control model and is entirely independent of police. We've covered that in your evidence and in your submission. The next is, given the ongoing history of colonialism and negative impacts of policing on Victorian First Peoples, the new police oversight body should ensure the culturally appropriate handling of complaints made by Victorian First Peoples. Presumably that would be something that Yoorrook may be interested in offering some recommendations on. In your work, do you have anything to share with them in terms of how this could be done in practice?
I think it would be very important for it to be done. I think there's enough community-controlled, Aboriginal community-controlled organisation and expertise, for example, at VALS. But you're talking about, if there's faith in the organisation that it's going to be truly independent from police, I think it would be possible to recruit First Nations investigators. It has been somewhat difficult to recruit Aboriginal investigators to Victoria Police, for example, because of lack of confidence in the police. There's been some accounts of very difficult work relations of Aboriginal people working in the police.
And I guess that raises the question too, even if you did do a completely independent oversight, if you've only got Aboriginal people there as investigators but without any real power in the executive and in the way that the body operates, the risk is that it just becomes, again, Aboriginal people working at the bottom of the pile with no real power to change anything. It's more window dressing than it is self-determination.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Commissioner. I wouldn't argue against that.
The next is that the new police oversight body should have complete control over what's considered a complaint warranting investigation. So I understand that to mean not establishing some unduly technical threshold for investigation to proceed. And have the power to initiate investigations on its own motion, essentially in the public interest. The new police oversight body should have powers of a police officer. We've touched on that. Required to provide information requested by the new police oversight body for the purposes of investigation. So just to explain that, police can be compelled, essentially.
Essentially compelled. I mean, my legislation said that the police must give information to the Ombudsman in conducting his investigations, because otherwise you have investigation by negotiation, and that's not acceptable from an independence point of view. As I said earlier, had to threaten to judicially review the Chief Constable because of his failure to give me what I felt was information critical to investigations that I was undertaking. In the end, it didn't go to court because there was a new chief constable, and he, as he said himself, opened the books, as it were. But I couldn't have done that had I not had the legislation and the powers to underpin what I was doing. So it was critical to Pony, it was critical to confidence in its investigations that the community felt it was getting access to all the information that it needed.
The next is transparency.
Before we move on, can I just say something about the own initiative investigations? That was an important component of Pony's work, because quite often and on occasion there would be an incident that received quite a great deal of public scrutiny through newspaper reports or whatever. There necessarily wouldn't have been a complaint arising from that, but certainly it was something which I felt as Ombudsman had an impact on public confidence in policing and therefore needed to be investigated. And I opened up an investigation into that particular incident. So it was an important part of the toolkit that I had, which I felt, again, demonstrated the independence of the office to be able to look at issues of which were public concern. So own initiative investigations I felt were important. There weren't many, but for those that I did open, I felt they were significant.
The next is 7 is transparency we've touched on, and you mentioned in 8 the need for the oversight or control of the organisation, not being a police officer or a former police officer. Was the experience in Northern Ireland that police involvement affected the credibility of the organisation?
I think there's two dimensions to that. I mean, I am firmly of the view that whoever heads a police oversight body should not be a police officer. That is about civilian control, civilian independence of police oversight, because so for me, a civilian perspective is one which moves away from the groupthink that can exist within policing. It can take a perspective on issues which is more from a community point of view to say, actually, I don't think that's acceptable. You might think it's acceptable from an operational point of view, but I don't think it's acceptable from a civilian perspective. So the head of that organisation sets the tone, the culture, the ethos, and therefore I do think that it is important that an individual who does head up police oversight is not a police officer. Having said that, it was absolutely critical to the success of the organisation when I was there, I felt, to have experienced ex-police officers as part of the organisation. It was critical when I investigated complaints into troubles. I had some very experienced former detectives working in the office who had the technical skills to undertake quite complex cold case reviews. And that mix of civilian and former police officer staff, because I recruited civilian staff and the office recruited civilian staff from a range of individuals, whether it be other ombudsman's offices, other regulatory bodies, military and so on. That mix with police in the context of our own culture of an independent oversight body was important. So while the head of an organisation, in my opinion, should not be a police officer, I think it's critical that you get the right mix of technical skills as part of the operations within the organisation to get the technical competence to do the work that you need to do.
The next is your recommendation of a single ombudsman who is an officer of Parliament. Is that about accountability, as we've discussed before?
Yeah.
And visibility, would you say, Michael?
I think visibility, I mean, there was quite a lot of confidence invested in the person who held the position of police ombudsman. It was hugely important that as ombudsman I could, make public statements that the office was recognised in the context of an individual, and that helped. I think did develop, certainly in its early days of the office, help confidence in the work that it did and its independence from the police. Yeah.
And your final recommendation is around resourcing. We've seen in Australia, not just in this jurisdiction, but in others, the unresourcing or the stripping of budgets of important public offices of accountability do you have an idea how you would establish that guarantee of adequate resourcing?
From my experience and looking across police oversight in different jurisdictions, what I've seen on occasion that the state can be very good at the architecture of oversight, can be very good at saying what we have in place is independent, it's necessary, and so on. But quite often where it fails is to follow that through in relation to the resources given to an organisation to allow it to undertake this work. I think if there was to be a body established in Victoria, then there needs to be a very detailed implementation plan looking at what is required to deliver this organisation on the ground, and that means resources. I'm involved in a piece of work in Queensland where it's a recommendation coming out of the Royal Commission. They're exactly that. This is about putting together a very clear understanding of what the organisation looks like, what resources are needed to make it work, and that those resources are adequate to undertake the business that it needs to do. So you can't enter into this blindly. You have to have a very clear understanding of what's required to make this work. Otherwise, you will have the architecture, but you will have the false assurance because the resources or the organisation will simply not have the resources to do the work that it needs to do.
You annexed to your submission your article, Reforming Police Oversight in Victoria, Lessons from Northern Ireland, published last year. Is there anything you would like to draw to the attention of commissioners from that article?
I feel like we've covered it.
Covered the key issues? Yep. Commissioners, do you have any questions of Professor McCulloch or Dr Maguire?
I've got just a quick one, and I guess it's more probably a comment than a question. So if you note in your article, and you've mentioned it here as well, that one of the key roles of the early colonial police was to clear the way for white settlement and to suppress resistance to dispossession. Why do you think that this different treatment and different approach to Aboriginal people has persisted into these current times? I'm not asking you to come up with an answer, but
it is a phenomenon familiar all around the world, isn't it?
yes,
That policing, over-policing, policing that is of an entirely different type to other groups persists in relation to First Nations people. Perhaps it is because that we'd be forced to recognise the enormous debt, the enormous state crimes that have been perpetrated against First Nations people. As I said, the enormous debt of the land, everything is built on the back of that violent occupation. And coming to terms with that appears to be hard for the state and many people, what that really means. And that criminalising just blocks out that idea that First Nations people have human rights which extend to repatriate, to getting stolen wages back, a whole host of things that the state and the people would have to come to terms with. But criminalisation makes white people in some ways the victims. So it's a comment, it's not really a specific answer, but I do think that it's systemic, and that there are structural things that can be done towards intervention. And one of those is changing policing, and that must involve accountability.
accountability to First Nations peoples.
Accountability to First Nations people, which will benefit all citizens, all people living in Victoria. But because of the continuing history of colonial violence, will make a big impact on First Nations people in particular.
Yes, one question for Professor McCulloch and another for Dr. Maguire. Professor McCulloch, you drew an analogy between the situation in Northern Ireland and the situation in Victoria. In Northern Ireland, two communities making up the one in serious political conflict with each other, one being over-policed and under-serviced, and independent policing based on human rights being part of the solution. And I think you were making the point in the context of treaty negotiations that are happening here, that the situation is something like that here. I wondered, could you explain that better than I have, what you meant by that remark?
I think you explained it quite well, but in Northern Ireland, there was a history of colonialism, British colonialism, and repression, coercion of Irish people, and the Catholic people in conflict around colonialism and occupation from 1969 when the British intervened, and the repression of a civil rights movement, which was the Catholic civil rights movement, led to an escalation of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but with a partial military presence and a militarised police force. And there are obvious differences between here and Northern Ireland, but the remarkable peace process where the policing piece was seen as central, it had to change to end the conflict, needed a police force that wasn't seen as partisan, wasn't seen as above the law, but accountable to all the people, and including all the people, was so important to ending that conflict, or partly healing that history of colonialism. There are still many echoes of it there now, and as I understand it, having my limited understanding from my networks in Northern Ireland, it's been good for everybody, been painful in some ways, but that acknowledging the history, acknowledging the need for change, acknowledging the part of police in the violence, not as protectors but as oppressors, has been really important in bringing about that change. And I know we're not in the same situation here. It's ridiculous to say we're like Northern Ireland for all sorts of reasons, if only because of sheer numbers. Indigenous people make up 3 or 4% of the population in Victoria, perhaps. So it's a different situation, but it's still the same issue of justice here, which is felt so intensely and appropriately, like by people who've been colonised in such a violent manner and continue to experience the violence of colonisation through policing.
Thank you. Dr. Maguire, you might like to make a follow-up remark if you wish on that same subject, but my question to you is different. And my question to you is, what was the initial attitude of the policing, of police as an institution and the police union as a workplace organisation to the changes, and did it change over time?
That's an exceptionally good question. I think the initial response of the senior management within the police to the establishment only was one of probably reluctant acceptance initially by the then Chief Constable. He saw the political reality of that this was coming, and therefore
Oh, he's gone.
Hello?
Got you back.
Sorry, Commissioner Bell, I seem to have dropped out there. I'll have to start that one again.
Yeah, start again if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. I think from a senior management point of view, I think the initial reaction from the police was one of reluctant acceptance. They understood the political realities of police reform, the political realities of the transition from the RUC to the PSNI. And the first Chief Constable was the Chief Constable of the RUC, who became the first Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So there was a political reality that senior police at the time just accepted. The response of the police unions, I think, was more interesting. Sorry, not more interesting, was different in the sense that they initially publicly accepted police oversight, independent police oversight, because they saw it as a benefit to police officers as well as the community. But I think their issues were more to do with implementation as to what that actually meant. I think it would be fair to say that neither, certainly senior ranks within the police or within the police unions, welcomed police oversight with open arms. They would have been unusual had that been the case. But it has changed and evolved over time. And in my experience of working with senior police officers for 7 years, they got police oversight. They understood it. They saw the benefits of it. They saw its importance in relation to community confidence. And they welcomed the fact that when there was a particular serious incident, that they would say this was subject to independent police oversight. And that was an important piece of building community confidence in policing, because they would be able to demonstrate, well, it did or did not happen according to that investigation. The police unions, I think, it's been much more mixed. And it had to do with the nature of recommendations coming from Pony and how they felt that impacted on their officers. I had my own issues with the head of the Police Federation, who felt that we were on a witch hunt against police officers, which I felt was absolute nonsense, given that in 70% of the investigations that we did, we found there was no misconduct by the police officer. It was a witch hunt. It wasn't a particularly good one in my regard. But what it demonstrated to me is that he didn't actually get independent police oversight. He didn't get what it was about. And so I had my own difficulties in that regard. So it's fair to say it was, from a police union point of view, it was more mixed. We surveyed police officers as part of the process. And in the main, when you look at the survey results, officers felt they'd be treated fairly and independently. And they may have criticised us over the length of, legitimately in some cases, the length of time it took to undertake an investigation.
Thank you.
Have the commissioners no further questions? Just remains to ask you if there's, here he's back. Anything you wish to say in closing?
Sorry about that. Not the Wi-Fi seemed to be more unstable in my experience in the past.
Well, it's just about,
so yeah, it has changed over time. In that.
Just Dr. McGrath was just asking if there's anything you wish to say in closing, and we might just be ahead of the technology in asking you to do that.
Okay.
Only that.
I think the one thought that occurs to me was that, you know, the issues in relation to police accountability, I think, are well documented. The over-policing and under-servicing of First Peoples is well documented. This is an incredible opportunity to change the nature of police oversight in Victoria. And this will be to the benefit of all citizens, particularly, I think, First Peoples, because of the nature of their interaction with the police. And I would urge commissioners to, in their recommendations, to look at the importance of police oversight, to look at the benefits that it can provide to all Victorians, but
Professor McCulloch.
I think that Michael summed it up well. This is an incredible opportunity. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to speak here on this topic. I think that there is an appetite and some opportunity for real change, and I feel like this process can really contribute to it. And I agree totally with Michael. It'll be important for all Victorians, but because of the normalisation of criminalisation of First Nations people, there needs to be an intervention in that. And this, to my mind, having practiced law and being a criminologist, is one important, necessary thing that could be done.
Dr. Maguire, I think we cut you off at you were finishing your answer. Did you finish, or is there anything else you'd like to add? You were mentioning the opportunity.
No. Hopefully I've made my point about the opportunity that this Commission inquiry presents to really and substantively change police oversight to the benefit of everybody, but particularly First Peoples.
It remains to thank Professor McCulloch and Dr. Maguire for joining us this evening. That concludes their evidence. I tender the submission and the next article, and they will be allocated the next number in the exhibit list. Thank you, Chair.
Council.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you.
McCulloch, and thank you very much, Dr. Maguire. We find your evidence very, very valuable, and we are hoping that we can make some change because it's well and truly overdue, as you well know. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll adjourn until tomorrow, 10 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners.